So maybe we could start by, there's the big meetings going on this week between your prime minister and the Trump administration. What is Israel's take on the significance of these meetings?
Well, it's hard to imagine a meeting more significant than this. Everything hinges on this meeting, and I'll explain. Israel, together with the United States, have won one of the greatest military victories, certainly in modern history, certainly in modern memory, against Iran and Iran's proxies. Countries that have been under the thumb or the heel of Iran for decades, Lebanon, Syria, are now free, suddenly free. And so if pressure can be retained on Iran, if there's still a credible military option against Iran, and not letting it get off the mat, then these countries will be free, not just in terms of their own population, they'll be free to make peace with the state of Israel. And you can see peace sort of reigning across the Middle East in a way that, as a cab driver said to me the other day, we're not living during historic times, we're living during biblical times. So it was interesting. So that's huge. If Iran remains subdued, then Hamas will internalize that it's totally isolated, and will perhaps take the deal that's offered to it, which is a prolonged ceasefire, followed by demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, followed by the exile of Hamas leaders, the rebuilding of Gaza in a peaceful way, and of course, the redemption of our hostages. So the entire region could change. It could also swing the other way. Iran's going to come back. It's going to start coming back already. And we have to know, I think that what the Prime Minister is going to have to try to ascertain from the President is whether the United States is willing to keep up that military pressure. It's not easy because American public opinion is running very much against it.
Right. So going to Iran and the U.S. strike with the B-2s, I know Israel was very appreciative of U.S. involvement. There was, I guess, some disputing over whether it was totally obliterated. The president likes to use that word. Others have suggested it's maybe set him back a couple of years. What?
It's irrelevant. The question is moot.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter whether the sites were extensively damaged or, as the president says, obliterated. There are only two issues that are important, two questions. One is, what are Iran's motives at this point? Mm-hmm. Is it committed to rebuilding them? Because even if they're totally destroyed or they're very destroyed, you're going to rebuild them. And secondly, what will be the United States' response if Iran tries?
Yeah.
There's only two questions that matter right now.
Yeah. And do Israeli citizens or maybe the government, do they feel confident that President Trump will? I mean, he's only going to be president for another 3.5 years.
And the Iranians could wait him out.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote a controversial article the other day. I tend to write controversial articles. We can hear more about them. But I suggest in this article that we tend to look at what happened with Iran, what we call, the Rising Lion operation, and the Americans call Midnight Hammer. We view it through Western eyes. But you have to view it also through Iranian eyes. This is a regime that survived much more punishing strikes during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. This is a regime that's learned Israel's soft spot, learned that we cannot sustain long-term large civilian casualties from these huge rockets they were shooting at us, that the United States was willing to bomb, but only bombed for one night when everything was cleared. There was not much danger to American pilots. And then when the Iranians fired some rockets at Qatar in a rather, a performative way, the United States immediately sued for a ceasefire and then forced Israel to accept that ceasefire. Yeah. So the Iranians may conclude that the Americans have no stomach for this. And they're also looking at the same polls I'm looking at. They're looking at, close to 90% of the American public says we don't want a continued war in the Middle East. They're looking at that.
Yeah.
So if you're an Iranian, you think, okay, I weathered this. But I think in some strange way, the regime is more popular today than it was before the war. People have rallied around it. They may hate the regime of the Ayatollahs, but they don't like anybody else bombing them. And they may think, well, it's worth a try. We have nothing to lose by trying to go forward. They may also move to create an atomic weapon.
Yeah.
Why? Because we don't necessarily know where all the highly enriched uranium is hidden. They still have rockets. They have a warhead program somewhere. You stick the highly enriched uranium in a warhead, you stick that on a rocket, and you are a nuclear power. And you can do it quietly, and you can do it quickly.
Yeah.
And so Israel and the United States have to be very, very prepared to act. It's a big question right now.
Yeah. Do you feel like President Trump, you mentioned he applied pressure on the Israeli government. Do you feel like that's what's going to be going on this week?
The question is does that pressure continue?
Yeah.
So you remember after the Iranians fired these rockets at Qatar, at the American base, then President Trump accepted the ceasefire, announced the ceasefire, and then they fired some rockets at us that were very damaging, right, and killed people. And Israel sent warplanes up to retaliate, and President Trump gave an order, turn them around. They did a big U-turn in the air. The question is, the order still the order of the day? Not to forgive the redundancy, but is it still in effect? Or will President Trump give us, Israel, the green light to preempt any Iranian intent to rebuild or certainly to nuclearize? And if beyond the green light, is the United States also willing to participate in such an operation?
Yeah. You mentioned that Americans don't have an appetite for involvement in wars overseas. And we're 20 months on from October 7. Mm-hmm. What's the Israeli appetite for, like going in and removing Hamas entirely, which is kind of what was said early on. Now, some would say that, they're getting a lifeline to survive this. Same with the leadership in Iran. I know Benjamin Netanyahu's had his ups and downs over the years. And as you wrote recently, he looked like he was left for dead many times politically. Mm-hmm. But he's leading the charge. And do Israeli citizens, do you think the support is there to continue to go in for the kill shot?
It's diminished in some ways exceedingly, mm-hmm. and I'll explain. Israel has won, as I said earlier, military victories, but they're unusual military victories. We won a victory against Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is still there, and it still has tens of thousands of rockets. We won a military victory against Iran. Iran is still a military power. And we won a victory against Hamas. The question is, can we transform those military victories into strategic triumphs? Now, so far, we've had a strategic triumph basically on all fronts, because none of these entities, or Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, threaten our existence anymore. They don't. And they've been deterred. Can we turn those strategic triumphs into permanent strategic victories? Mm-hmm. That's the big question. And everything there hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
Now, if there's a prolonged ceasefire in Gaza, yes, Hamas will come out of the tunnels. Hamas will rearm. Hamas will regain control of the Gaza Strip in one way or the other. It'll maybe take many, many years before it can threaten us again, but it'll always be there. And if you have family, you have kids, you wouldn't exactly move down to that border today either. They fired 7 rockets this week, still, at border communities. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, almost all of them were taken down. They don't hit. And so there's still a danger there. Right. And it'll render parts of the country uninhabitable. The big question is, how much do Israelis continue to fight? There's an interesting statistic I came upon some time ago that made during the Vietnam War. There was a study of American combat soldiers, and said that after 40 days of continuous combat, the efficacy of a soldier goes down to close to zero. Some of these soldiers have been in combat for 500 days. 500 days. It's inconceivable. Now, I spent, 35 years in the military. I've been in several wars. I even was briefly serving in this war. But there's nothing in my military experience that can in any way approach what these young people have been through daily. They're talking about combat 24/7 in impossible physical and moral situations.
Yeah.
And they're exhausted. They're tired. And these are not kids. These are heads of families. These are business owners. Some of them, well into middle age.
Yeah.
And so there's only so far you can press them. And I think what the Army is saying to the political echelon is that you can't stretch this rope any further than you're stretching. You're going to have to start winding this down. And if it means that Hamas survives, but it survives in a much, much diminished way, and we prepare for the next round, the next time we get them, and they don't dare attack us again, mm-hmm. and we get Americans' approval for that, right? The next time they fire a rocket, we go in. But the most important thing is we get our hostages back.
Yeah.
This is so difficult for an American audience to understand the meaning of hostages to this country. It's something very different than any other place in the world. And there's an unwritten covenant between the state of Israel and the people of Israel that if you go out to fight and you're captured, or even you're captured, don't go out to fight, you're captured in your home, the state of Israel will do everything in its power to get you back. And, my daughter, a combat veteran, said, Dad, if we don't get those hostages back, I can't send my kids to the army. And I know many, many people like that.
Yeah. And I guess as of today, there's how many that are presumed to be alive? 24?
20, whatever. Yeah, 24 to 29.
Yeah.
One does not know, and it also depends on how you define alive.
Right. Yeah, we visited the October 7th sites yesterday. Very sobering to see and have it explained on some of the boards that this is what happened at such and such time. How was the security breached the way that it was? I mean, there's Netanyahu has taken some criticism for, the security services and so on not being ready for that. And yet, as you wrote in your article recently, he's weathered that storm as well. Was Israel asleep at the wheel at that point?
Very much.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book about this now. I'm writing a book about the entire war, from October 7th till basically this morning. A very large book for HarperCollins in New York. And I've had to go into depth about what happened. Where was the intelligence failure? And by the way, it wasn't just an Israeli intelligence failure, it was an American intelligence failure. There's nothing that Israeli intelligence concluded that the American intelligence didn't conclude. And that conclusion, and I was in government at the time, so I saw it firsthand, at a front row seat, and it was that Hamas had no interest in going to war with us. Hamas wanted to focus on developing the internal situation, the economy within the Gaza Strip, and that if you paid them off with Qatari money, and if you let 20,000 Gazan workers into Israel so that they had nice salaries and give Hamas something to lose, that Hamas would continue to focus on the internal situation in Gaza and not think about war. And that's the basic of it. Many other things went wrong. We were too dependent on Iron Dome. We became very defensive-minded rather than offensive-minded. We didn't invest in our reserves. We didn't give them, we didn't train enough. We didn't give them the right equipment. Many other things went wrong there, but that's the basic fault, was misreading Hamas. Mm-hmm. And by the way, people from the West, and this is a Western country, make that mistake again and again.
Yeah.
President Obama made that mistake with Iran. You pay them enough money in the Iran nuclear deal, and they will become, quote unquote, a responsible regional power. I hope that President Trump isn't making that same mistake now, even by thinking that if you build up Gaza into a hotel district and create jobs, they're going to change. This is in the DNA of these organizations and these peoples, in the DNA. They exist to conduct holy war. They exist to kill us. That's what they're about.
Yeah.
And no amount of money, no amount of economic incentives or jobs is going to change that. The only thing that will change that is, one, a credible military deterrent. And even that's very difficult. Some of them, these are death cults. They welcome death. And the other is education, changing the education, the way they raise young people. In Gaza, I know this. I went through their education system. Are trained from before they can walk, that the holiest thing they can do is chop off an infidel's head. That's what they know. And if you look at their education system, the horrors they committed on October 7th actually become very understandable.
Yeah. I read another column recently about just how the killing Jews is basically in their religious texts as well. So how do you, I guess if I'm getting it right, the nuclear, or rather the military deterrent is the most important. I mean, changing the education from
a long time. That could take 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years. Right now, though, it has to be deterrent.
Right.
And it's difficult because, again, I had a great professor when I studied named Bernard Lewis, who was an expert, and he used to say to me, mutually assured destruction for the Iranians and other jihadists is not deterrence, it's incentive.
Right.
It's their one-way ticket to paradise.
Yeah. So
and if they could take you out en route, that's
right.
To get
a lot of them came in and were on that kind of a mission on October 7th. They were prepared
to die
after killing as many Jews as they could.
And it's also it's difficult for us when we negotiate with them. Okay, and I'm saying we, meaning in the West, because we're used to negotiating with people who operate on a cost-benefit, basis, but we're not used to negotiating with people for whom death
Right.
is a very real and logical option.
Right.
So right now, the heads of Hamas in Gaza, when they're offered a deal, they say, "Well, I prefer martyrdom to that. I prefer death to that," and that's not rhetoric. They prefer martyrdom.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you hope President Trump's not making the same mistake. Do you feel like President Trump or Steve Witkoff, I think is his name, are putting too much trust in some of these nations that have this radical ideology that, as you say, that it's in their DNA?
Because they're business people and they're used to dealing with people around the table who are playing according to a certain set of rules,
Right.
logical rules. But these people do not play it according to those logical rules.
Well, do you see...
I had a very bad day in 2017. One day the Prime Minister called me and says, "I got some bad news for you. You're going to be dealing with Gaza." And I dealt with Gaza, so I know a lot about Gaza. And one of the first things I did was to go down and visit the southern command of our internal security operation, the Shin Bet. And the head of it, who later became the national security advisor, put a slide up on the wall. And the slide showed Ismail Haniyeh, one of the late former heads of Hamas, standing on a pile of rubble that had been somebody's neighborhood and giving a V sign. And the head of the Shin Bet says, "Well, is that a victory pose or is that a defeat pose?" So being, American educated, I said, "Well, it's a defeat pose." He says, "You don't understand. That's a victory pose. We can bomb them to dust. But if they can get up and do this, they've won."
Yeah.
And that's, I fear, just what the Iranians are doing right now.
Yeah.
They're getting up and going like this. And we have to understand that. Right? All they have to do to win is not lose.
Right. Not surrender.
Whereas all we do to lose is not win.
Yeah. Did President Trump use the word surrender? That's what he demanded of Iran.
Unconditional surrender.
Unconditional surrender, right. And it just doesn't seem like that we get those terms, from either Hamas or, like you say, I mean, they've been hit hard. Hezbollah's been hit hard. Iran was hit hard, but they all survived. And so do you feel like that Israelis are uneasy about negotiation with these kinds of movements?
Certainly. You see from the books, I'm a historian by training, and the first time that term was used, unconditional surrender, was at the Casablanca Conference in 1943 with Churchill and Roosevelt. And when they said unconditional surrender about Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, they understood that they were going to have to keep bombing them for years, and basically totally obliterate them and rebuild them from scratch. You don't get total surrender just by bombing for a few nights. That doesn't happen. And while I don't think Americans, again, are going in the mood to move their army into Iran the way the United States Army moved into Germany and Japan, but you'd have to keep on pounding them much, much harder to get them into the mindset of surrender, because they're not there. Now, President Trump has expressed a desire to go back into negotiations with the Iranians, and the hope there would be that not only would the United States continue to demand the total dismantling of the nuclear program, not a cap on enrichment, but dismantling, and that dismantling has to then be very closely monitored and observed, but also the end to what's called euphemistically Iran's malign behavior. It's one of my favorite terms, because malign behavior is what your kid does when he comes into a room and he wrecks it. That's malign behavior. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror in the world, sponsoring terror across the world, including in the United States. Trying to assassinate American leaders, including President Trump, including yours truly. They tried to assassinate me in Washington. It's killing American service people by the hundreds. It's stopping international shipping. It's complicity in the massacre of 500,000 Syrians. I mean, it's a very, very long list. And of course, repeated attempts to destroy us through Hamas and Hezbollah and the Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. Why does the United States not come to Iran and say, okay, this has got to stop too? No more. No more death to America. Yeah. No more death to Israel. That's over.
What differences would you say are between President Trump's first term? I mean, you were in government during the first one,
Sure.
and you helped with him recognizing the Golan Heights.
Yeah.
They moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And then this time around, it just seems like, he's reaching out to so many of these other Middle Eastern nations when Israel has traditionally been America's strongest ally in this area of the world. Do you feel like there has been a noticeable shift or change in his thinking going from the first term to this one?
Well, there was a notable shift from the beginning of the second term to where we are now.
Okay.
Because he
in what way?
Well, on one hand, he made Prime Minister Netanyahu the first foreign leader to be his guest at the White House, and that was significant.
Right.
But in the second of those meetings, he also surprised the Prime Minister by announcing direct talks between Iran and the United States, something that Biden hadn't done. Biden had talks, but they weren't direct. The President Trump cut a deal with the Houthis for a ceasefire that didn't include Houthis' fire on the state of Israel, which continues to this day, and a very close relationship between the president and Erdogan of Turkey, who is a rank anti-Semite and considered a danger by the state of Israel, not an ally. So that was difficult, very difficult. Then during the war with Iran, he came back and supported us very strongly. But also during his first visit abroad in the second term, the president came to the Middle East and skipped over Israel.
Right.
And went to the Gulf. There's only one other president who did that, and that was Barack Obama.
Right.
Now, I understand why President Trump did that. His duty as president of the United States is to strengthen America's economy, and those Gulf states can strengthen America's economy in the way we can. We can make America more secure. I don't think we make America richer. But the message to the region. See, again, Americans, Westerners, and Israelis, we all tend to look at this region through Western eyes and not Middle Eastern eyes. So if I have an ally and that ally ignores me, then the impression I get is that there is daylight between us, that we can insinuate ourselves between these two former friends. And that's dangerous. That was the argument I had repeatedly with the Obama administration during my time in Washington was, you think that by putting daylight between you and Israel, you think that it's going to make people in the Middle East, more open to peace, more pro-American. On the contrary, I worked a lot in the peace process, and I got to know some Palestinians fairly well. And what they told me shocked me. They said, we don't trust President Obama. I said, why don't you trust him? He's the most pro-Palestinian president in history. How can you not trust him? He says, we don't trust people who don't stick by their allies. And there you have it.
Wow.
We don't trust people who don't stick by their allies.
Going back to your statement about the change in President Trump's thinking, even since the start of this year, I think a pretty good example of that was recently you mentioned the planes he demanded they turn around. And, on the night that the U.S. bombed those nuclear sites, I think he said something about he and Prime Minister Netanyahu worked like a team, like no other team in history.
It was an amazing speech, by the way.
Yeah.
Incredible speech.
And then 3 days later, he was so angry, he used profanity, and he basically said Israel doesn't know what it's doing. Or how did whether in government or the commentators, how did the country react to President Trump cursing at Israel?
Not very favorably. Yeah. It wasn't the curse, it was the way that he put us in the same boat with Iran, that we both are out of our minds.
Right.
Iran has been attacking us for 46 years and trying to destroy us. We're trying to defend ourselves. I don't call that insanity.
Right.
I call that the height of clear-mindedness. So it was very disturbing. I mean, one of the great strengths of this president is that he's so unpredictable. And I will say, unequivocally, as someone who worked during the Obama and Biden years, you could predict what those two presidents were going to do with about 95% certainty. That saying 95% with this president is with uncertainty, and because he does kind of go around, which is very good to keep people off balance in the Middle East. Nobody knows if there's anything that's stopping the Iranians from building Fordo tomorrow, rebuilding Fordo, is that they don't know what he's going to do. And one of my criticisms that I've written about repeatedly over the last 20 years was that Israel had become entirely too predictable in our responses to threats and to terror. You knew what we were going to do. We knew that, you knew that Hamas was going to fire 1,000 rockets at us, and we were going to bomb them from the air. And if they kept on firing rockets at us, we'd send some troops in, and the end we'd agree to a ceasefire and give them some money. That's pretty much what happened 4 times on the Gaza. We've been completely predictable, and look what happened.
Yeah.
Look what happened. So there's a great strength in being unpredictable in this region. But sometimes, on some issue, what can I say? As a citizen of Israel, as a father and a grandfather, I'd like to have a little bit more predictability.
Yeah. What did you make of the following October 7? There were some astute commentators that said the sympathy for Israel will maybe last a few hours, maybe a day.
That was me.
Well,
I said 3 weeks.
Yeah.
I said 3 weeks.
So
it was very difficult. I went on Israeli television, and everyone kind of saying, the whole world was with us. The whole world was with us. I said, guys, look at your watches. 3 weeks. I was off by about a week and a half with the British.
Right.
The British were about a week and a half. We had a grace period, and I knew it would end.
Yeah. Well, even when they were carrying out the attack, the attackers, the terrorists, were celebrating. Mm-hmm. And, the one guy who called home and said, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands. And, he was so proud of it. But it's almost like you see that same attitude in the ones taking to the streets in Britain, in some cases the United States, and a lot of Western nations, and they're cheering for this. And then, Israel has to fight that narrative, the propaganda that, you're blowing up hospitals or whatever else. Is it, you kind of alluded to history. Is there's just something different? You talked about the difference in Israel's thinking not being, predictable or being too predictable, I guess you said. But just given the reaction, for me, it was shocking to see people in London or wherever actually showing
American
support.
Campuses, 60 American campuses. It's a product of 2 factors. One is just old anti-Semitism. And, the British government, before the Iran part of this war, the British government had sanctioned 2 of our ministers, 2 of our very right-wing ministers. And I go on the BBC and I said to the BBC, I said, I don't agree with these ministers, and a lot of what they do repulses me. But your decision by the British government is anti-democratic, it's anti-British, and it's anti-Semitic. Anti-democratic, obviously, because these people were elected. You're not sanctioning other despotic regimes in the world, totalitarian regimes. You're sanctioning democratically elected leaders of a failed democracy. 2, anti-British, because we're fighting the same people who are trying to take you down. Hamas wins here. Guess what's going to happen in the streets of London? But why was it anti-Semitic? Anti-Semitic because the British government singled out the state of Israel. They didn't put sanctions on China, the Chinese government that's put 1 million Muslims in concentration camp. They don't sanction Turkey or Qatar, who support terror. They don't do that. They choose the one Jewish state in the world to sanction. And by definition, singling Jews out is anti-Semitic. And so much of the vehement criticism of Israel, whether it's in the Western press or on these campuses in the United States, was typical anti-Semitic tropes just out of the Middle Ages. The accusation is that we're committing genocide or we're getting up and we're committing war crimes. People ever ask themselves, well, why is it that the state of Israel does this? Their answer has to be there's something inherently evil about this country. They have inherently evil about the people who inhabit this country. We wake up in the morning and we want to kill children. Wake up in the morning, we want to kill innocent people. That's right out of the blood libels of the Middle Ages. Right out of it. Still there. Very, very powerful. So that's one reason. And latent anti-Semitism was a great Irishman, Conor Cruz O'Brien, who said famously that anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. And this woke it up. The second reason, and I think it's even a more profound reason, is the same people who are accusing us of genocide, of war crimes, calling for our elimination as a state, they hate their own society. They hate their own people. They hate America. They burn American flags. Listen to what they're saying. They're calling for the overthrow of Western civilization. They're calling for the United States in the same route. And they have been educated to think this way. They've been educated to think this way by the universities, particularly if they're coming out of the elite universities. And they've been educated to think this way by social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you feel like, again, going back to negotiating, with these people when that thinking is so strong. I guess, just from where I come from on my podcast, I just say, how do you even talk to them? How do you sit down with them?
You don't, in most cases.
Yeah.
Now, for Jews, that's a problem, because the Jewish method for fighting anti-Semitism for decades was sort of three-pronged. One is you expose them, you shame them, and then you educate them. But that didn't work anymore, because these people didn't have to be exposed. They were out in the street. They weren't ashamed. They were proud.
Yeah.
And thirdly, they couldn't be re-educated. So you got to sort of really change your thinking about how to deal with this. And it was a real sort of trauma, especially for these organizations that had made this was their goal, was to fight anti-Semitism. Very, very difficult. But the problem here, I think, is deeper. It has to do with who thinks their civilization and country is worth fighting for. One of the terrific, truly extraordinary achievements of this country is that in the course of this war, starting on October 7th, 2023, roughly 400,000 Israelis went out, picked up a gun and went out to fight, knowing full well that they could come home in a radically different way or not come home at all. Left their families, left their jobs. 400,000 people, in proportionally speaking, would be about 25 million Americans. That's about 8 or 9 million Americans more than fought in all of World War II. And you want to say to yourself, okay, where in the world does this happen? Well, who's willing to go and pick up a gun and fight for Belgium today? Who's willing to go out and pick up a gun and even fight for Italy, Spain? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But nothing like this. So in many ways, we're the Western country par excellence. We are willing to fight. We have a population here that's willing to fight. Mm-hmm. We have an elite that's very loyal.
Yeah, and you have, as you wrote recently, you have a leader who's the right man for the job. I think I forget how you said, there's leaders in history and then there's
leaders of history.
Leaders of history.
Well, Netanyahu feels that he was born for this moment.
Right.
And that's not, you don't always have that. I know Joe Biden thought he was born for the moment to be a transformative president, but I think Obama did. But having a loyal elite is a big advantage. If I can go into this, I am a graduate of these elite universities. I taught at these elite universities, and some of these universities have walls that are inscribed with the names of every graduate that died in America's wars, going back to the French and Indian War, the 1750s, the Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War, World War I, World War II, long lists. Then all of a sudden, starting around Korea, the lists start getting real short. By the time you hit Vietnam, it's shorter, and after Vietnam, almost really nothing. And there was a time when the graduates of these universities had a sort of a noblesse oblige. They came out and said, listen, I owe something to this society. I'm going to go out and fight for the society. Mm-hmm. The last great representative of that was George Bush Sr. Was a fighter pilot, Navy pilot in World War II. Yeah. Graduate of Yale.
Even the Operation Rising Lion, taken out of the Book of Numbers. And then when the Prime Minister made his statement after the so-called 12-day war, he referred to a proverb about wise counsel that was guiding this operation. And I was making a point recently that, it is unusual just to hear a world leader that's referencing, Bible passages. Because I don't think Bibi is ultra religious, but that's Israel's history. And, they're talked about in the Bible as having a lion-like spirit. You kind of have touched on just the changing mentality over the years, like with America, for example. Last week was the 49th anniversary of the Entebbe rescue mission. What would you say is, you've lived in Israel for how long?
Well, I certainly sort of came to Israel repeatedly before Entebbe and after Entebbe, and I moved to several years after it.
Okay. What differences are there from that 49 years ago to the mentality you're talking about among Israelis today?
So there's a sea of difference, and in certain ways there's absolutely no difference. So what's the sea of difference? I came to a country that was a backwater. It was a lower middle class backwater. Our biggest export item was orange juice. And very isolated. We didn't have relations with China. We didn't have relations with what was called the Soviet bloc, which was 12 countries plus Russia. We didn't have relations with India. We didn't have relations with Africa. We didn't have peace with Egypt. We didn't have peace with Jordan. We didn't have certainly peace with the Abraham Accord countries. Isolated. We had a nice relationship with the United States. We didn't have a strategic alliance with the United States. And there were 3 million Jews who were trapped behind the Soviet Union, trapped behind the Iron Curtain, couldn't get out. So a very, very different place. So see a difference. I mean, we weren't the high-tech giant we are today, and every Jew in the world is free today. And we have these relations, and these relations are strained right now, but no one's breaking off relations with us. Mm-hmm. Almost nobody. And with the United States, we have one of the deepest bilateral strategic alliances which the United States has had with any country in the post-World War II period. And we have peace. Peace with the countries. If you ever told me I was going to have peace with these countries in the 1970s, I would have told you, you're crazy. You're really crazy. So that has changed. Very different country. Become much more materialistic. A more, big social divide between rich and poor that we didn't have back then. But what I thought had changed, and myself and so many other people were wrong when it changed. We thought that this new generation, what they call the TikTok generation, that they were soft and they were selfish, right? And they wouldn't sacrifice. And we were completely wrong. As much as Yoni Netanyahu and his commanders went off to free the hostages at Entebbe on July 4th, 1976, just an entire generation of young Israelis went out to fight and are still fighting. And I didn't know if they had it in them, but they had them in them much, much more than I ever imagined. So this is the same. This generation is probably the greatest generation we've had since our founding. My father landed on Normandy. He was part of that greatest generation, but this is our greatest generation.
The October 7 massacre has been called Israel's 9/11 by certain commentators.
Sure.
And then when you mentioned the numbers, 400,000 soldiers and what that would be in America, it's, the carnage was many times over 9/11.
It was 14 times, if you want to know.
Yeah.
Exactly. 14 times 9/11.
But that it took that, because America, our reaction to 9/11 was pretty active and intense as well, going into, Afghanistan and Iraq. And now, you fast forward 20 some years and this administration really wants to, get rid of the forever wars, as he calls them, and not get engaged abroad. Don't you think that, October 7, yes, the fighting spirit is still there, but I guess my thinking is what it took for that to be aroused.
Sure.
And the fact that leading up to it, there was, as I said.
What President Eisenhower used to call the wrath of an aroused democracy, right? And we were an aroused democracy. The big difference between the United States and Israel, and there are many differences. The pretext for going into Iraq, many people thought that the Bush administration had misled them. Afghanistan, it wasn't clear what the goal was. Was it to rebuild Afghanistan and turn it into an American-style democracy, a country that that couldn't happen. But the big difference is that Iraq and Afghanistan were many, many thousands of miles away from the United States. Mm-hmm. I'm talking to you now, a 50-minute drive from Gaza.
Yeah.
Where you're sitting has been under fire repeatedly, not just since October 7th, but even before that, for years. Running in and out of our bomb shelter, which is in the room next door. This is all intensely personal, up close.
Right.
As close as you can get. And it's not like we had a choice. It's not a choice. The equivalent the comparison would be not just 9/11, but if in the aftermath of 9/11, jihadists had streamed into American homes and farms and communities and beheaded and raped and burnt and eviscerated and took captives. What would America's response have been then? Mm-hmm. Not just to send the American army in somewhere. You would have flattened a couple countries, flattened them.
Yeah. Going back to Bibi being the right man for the job, there's the big negotiations going on this week. On what points do you feel like he is willing? You could say he's already stood up to President Trump in a couple of key areas, one that infuriated the president. But what specific areas do you feel like he would part ways with President Trump?
Very difficult. President Biden, and I worked with Joe Biden for years and had a very good relationship with him and a high opinion of him. But he didn't project strength, neither personal nor national. And he said don't. Remember he said don't?
Right.
He said don't, and everybody did. They did. We did. He said don't go into Rafah, go into Lebanon. We did.
Right.
The Palestinians too did. The Iranians did. Hezbollah did. Everyone did. This president says don't, and I haven't seen anybody do yet. Maybe Putin a bit. Maybe Putin. And I think that we don't have the same type of latitude that we had under previous presidents, and I think that Netanyahu is going to think many, many times before going against the will of Donald Trump. Many times, and it's going to try his best to stay on the same page. At the end of the day, we're both sovereign countries. The United States is a big, big country. It's far away from the Middle East. It's not threatened with immediate annihilation. We're a small country. We are threatened with annihilation. We're in Iran's backyard. And our interests, as much as we may try, cannot always be consonant, cannot always dovetail. And sometimes we have to take our own actions. Now, you take a president like Ronald Reagan, who was tremendously pro-Israel. Prime Minister Menachem Begin had to make a decision to blow up the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. Right? Reagan didn't like that. He actually stopped up sales or deliveries of fighter jets to us for a while and condemned us in the Security Council. Sometimes we just, we got to take matters in our own hands because they're matters of paramount national security. Ultimately, that reactor would have threatened the United States in Baghdad. They didn't know that back in 1981. They weren't thinking 1991. So we did a huge favor to the United States. But I think in this case, there's a very strong case to be made that Iran threatens not just Israel, but threatens the United States in a very fundamental way.
So President Trump, you mentioned him saying don't, and that it carries more weight. On the other hand, he has on a number of occasions said do, and like he said, the hostages are going to come home on day one of the inauguration. He said the Ukraine war would, end.
No, Putin has defied him.
Okay, so, but do you feel like that together with, he wants to be a peacemaker. And
he does.
And sometimes it seems like he wants to make peace no matter the cost. Do you feel like there's Israelis that say, if you're wanting everything to be, quick and easy, drop a few bombs and then go back home? I guess what I'm asking is if you're kind of telegraphing the fact that you do not want a foreign war or a forever war, that it kind of handcuffs you to some degree when you are in the midst of all those negotiations.
Handcuff Israel or handcuff the United States, or both?
Yeah. Well,
certainly. The reason that the United States was totally incapable of containing the Iranian project, which was the takeover of the Middle East, and maintaining a nuclear threshold capability, and threatening to destroy us and exporting terror, was because the United States never had a serious military threat on the table. And the Iranians knew it. That Obama had a military threat on the table, but nobody ever thought he was going to use it except for people in the United States who feared it. His slogan was, it's either diplomacy or war, which was a total false dichotomy. First of all, because the Iranians have zero ability to make war against the United States. They don't have an air force. They barely have a navy. They certainly have no tank corps. It's not going to make war against the United States, but the only reason that it would succeed if diplomacy was backed up by real power. And don't get me started, because I think soft power is an oxymoron. I can't take the term soft power. So, but they're unwilling to do this. This president has been willing to use power, and I think that will greatly strengthen his hands in negotiations, but he's got to keep that option on the table, because if the Iranians internalize that there's no more military option, they won't compromise. Why should they? Yeah. Why should they? And think about it from their perspective. From an Israeli perspective, we, like any other American ally, have an interest in having a United States that is strong, that is willing to project power, and let's say very frankly, that is feared in the world, respected and feared. And here you could be talking to somebody from Germany, from South Korea, from Japan, they'll tell you exactly the same thing. Yeah. I've gone even further. I say I'd rather have a president who was critical of the state of Israel, but willing to project power, like George Bush Sr., That'd be better than have a president who wakes up in the morning and sings our national anthem, the Hatikva, but is unwilling to project power. We're better off with a tough president.
Yeah.
And I hope that Donald Trump will continue to be that tough president.
Yeah. You've referred to Obama a few times. I mean, you were ambassador during his first term. What would you say were his greatest weaknesses as a U.S. president?
Okay, his worldview. So I'll plug this book. This book, Ally. I have the most controversial part of this book. This is my memoir. It's about my life, but also my time in Washington. I did a study in the chapter in the book called Obama 101, where I read everything he ever written, every interview he ever gave, every speech he ever gave. Really sat down and like a historian and figured out, okay, who is this person? Because remember, when he was elected president, he'd been in the Senate for 2 years. Nobody knew really knew who he was. And I got a very clear idea of who he was, but also because I had spent a lot of time on American campuses, and his worldview was right out of a campus. And I could predict with 95% plus accuracy what he was going to do because I knew that worldview. And what was the worldview? I'll give you the short version of it. Great reluctance to use military power, discomfort with it. It didn't come naturally. A great reverence for international institutions, a belief in internationalism, the UN and other institutions, a critical view of the United States, a country that had committed X number of crimes in its history. And I'm not talking about slavery and foreign policy as well. An obsession, I must say, with the Palestinians, truly an obsession. You can't imagine the amount of time that the Obama administration devoted to the Palestinians, but ignored the massacre of 500,000 Syrians, okay? And massacres going on all over the world. And that was that worldview. And that, to me, everyone in the Middle East knew it. So, for example, I quoted these Palestinians I worked with who didn't respect Obama because he didn't stand by his allies. I also knew, as being involved in the first stages of what became known as the Abraham Accords, that Obama had set out to bring Jews or Israelis and Arabs closer in peace. And he succeeded in bringing us closer, just not through peace. He brought us closer through common opposition to his policies. The glue of the Abraham Accords, we'd like to think it's really high-tech, it's very nice. But what really brought us together was America's, on one hand, appeasement of Iran and America's refusal to project power. And our Arab friends would look at the situation and said, well, there's only one country that's standing up to our two mortal enemies, which is Sunni extremism and Shiite extremism. There's only one country. That was us. I also thought during this war that one of the reasons we had to win the war so they could win the peace, because countries, Arab countries, Muslim countries, would make peace with us if we showed that we're willing to stand up and beat Sunni extremism, Hamas, and Shiite extremism, Hezbollah and Iran. And we've done that. And I think we're going to get peace because of that. It is. John Lennon, forgive me, but you got to give war a chance.
I'm curious what you think about just the future. The dust has settled on there may be a ceasefire in Gaza. The dust has settled on the attack in Iran. What is your hope?
Oh, so my hope is, again, that this inflection point will point in the direction of peace, that Iran will continue to be deterred. Who knows, there may be an internal upheaval within Iran. I hope there will be. Lebanon will be free. Syria will be free. We can engage in types of peace processes with both these countries. Yes, our hostages will be released, that Gaza will no longer threaten us, that maybe there'll be a brighter future for the Palestinians as well. We can do that. We can be magnanimous in that way. And then Israel's going to have to start dealing with our internal schisms, because that's what, in many ways, was led to the war. The Hamas understood that we were divided and they could attack us. We have to address that.
Right.
And we have to begin to rebuild our relations in the world, because support for this country around the world, including in some of our closest friends, including the United States, has been seriously eroded. And we have to start rebuilding that. And I view that as part of my job in the future, is rebuilding those foreign relations.
Yeah. What future do you see for Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, as I've said repeatedly, it's always premature to eulogize him politically. I think he's very strong right now. And, you know, I've worked with prime ministers, I've worked with presidents, and I will tell you without reservation, being the prime minister of Israel is simply the hardest job on the planet. There's no weekends. There's no golf vacations in, you know, Nantucket or wherever, Martha's Vineyard. You don't do that. You don't sleep. And not everyone can do it physically. Not everybody can do it intellectually and be a communicator and be a politician. And there's just not many people like Benjamin Netanyahu. For all of his flaws, some of my best friends have, you know, suffered what I call from Bibi derangement, which is not that much different than Trump arrangement. If there's bad weather outside, it's because of Bibi, literally. But even they admit now that he is not just a difficult act to follow. He's almost right now an impossible act to follow. And as an historian, I would tell you that history remembers leaders in a way that different than they're seen by their contemporaries. Look, Lincoln was ridiculed, and Truman was ridiculed, really, especially Truman. Oh my God! And today they're remembered as some of the finest American presidents. Certainly Lincoln. And that's how we remembered, maybe in a different way, by history. But one thing I'll guarantee you, he'll be remembered.
Mm-hmm. How do you think President Trump will be remembered?
I'm going to give you an answer that Chinese leader Zhou Enlai gave to Henry Kissinger in 1972. Kissinger asked him, "Do you think the French Revolution was successful?" And Zhou said, "I don't know, it's too early." So it's too early. We have to see. I think President Trump will be remembered by the Jewish people because we have the greatest and longest memory of any people on earth. You know, we're going to remember King Cyrus for recognizing sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty of the Golan, for recognizing Jerusalem as our capital, for forging the Abraham Accords, for pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Like, there's a long list there. He will be remembered for a very long time, and 100, 200 years ago, now maybe 1,000 years from now, Jewish students will be learning about a gentleman named Donald Trump, who was a great friend to our people.
Michael Oren, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Your time.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
All right.